Some debts aren't paid in money, some are paid in people. Elise learned that on the night her stepbrother sold her, she had been doing what she always did at 10 o'clock on a Thursday. Sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment, she shared with 3 people who barely acknowledged she existed, running the numbers on a second-hand laptop that kept overheating. Invoice reconciliation for a logistics company that paid her $19 an hour and expected 40-hour weeks delivered in 30. She was good at it. She was fast. She could find a discrepancy in a 12-column spreadsheet faster than most people could find their car keys. Nobody at the company knew her name. They called her the bookkeeper. Her stepbrother Marcus knew her name. He just didn't use it when he needed something. He came in through the front door without knocking. He never knocked, not even after she'd changed the locks twice. And he looked the way he always looked when he'd done something that couldn't be undone. That specific kind of loose around the jaw, that brightness in the eyes that wasn't happiness. It was relief, the relief of a man who had just transferred his problem onto someone else's shoulders. "You need to come with me," he said. Elise didn't look up from the screen. "I'm working." Elise. The way he said her name made her look up. In 4 years of living under the same roof as Marcus and his mother Diane, she had developed a very specific sensitivity to the register of his voice when things were genuinely bad versus when he wanted something. This was a third category she hadn't encountered before. This was the voice of a man who had already decided. She closed the laptop. The drive took 40 minutes. Marcus didn't speak. The city thinned out around them and then thickened again differently. Fewer bodegas, more iron gates, less neon, more silence. When the car stopped in front of a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed intimidation was an architectural principle, Elise felt the first real thing she'd felt in months. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the sensation of the ground changing texture under her feet. 2 men were waiting outside. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they might as well have been. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was very even. She had learned to keep her voice even. "What did you do?" He couldn't look at her. That told her everything. Inside, the building was quiet, in the way that expensive things are quiet, not empty, just contained. She was brought through a hallway, and then another hallway, and then into a room that was all dark wood and low lamplight, and she thought absurdly of her spreadsheets, of the way a well-organized ledger looked, everything in its column, everything accounted for. The man behind the desk was not what she expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something louder, maybe, something that announced itself. Instead, there was a man in his early 40s, the kind of face that had once been striking and was now something harder, more settled. There was a scar that ran from his left jaw down toward his collar. He was looking at a document when she came in, and he finished reading it before he looked up, which told her something about his relationship to time. He didn't feel the social pressure to perform attention for her. He had actual attention, and he gave it when he was ready. His name was Kellner. She didn't learn his first name until much later. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "This is the collateral," he said. His voice was flat, not cruel, just precise. The voice of a man for whom words were instruments, not performances. Marcus said something Elise didn't fully process, because the word collateral was still moving through her like a stone through water, creating ripples she couldn't stop. Collateral. She understood then. She understood the number. She'd always been good with numbers. And the number Marcus owed this man was the kind of number that had started as a small problem and been ignored until it became structural. She understood the logic. She even understood, in the cold fluorescent part of her brain that never stopped running calculations, why it made a certain terrible sense. What she didn't understand was why she wasn't screaming. She thought about it later and decided it was because screaming would have required her to believe this was an aberration. And the truth was, it wasn't. Marcus had been selling pieces of her life for years, her savings once, when she'd been stupid enough to keep them in a joint account, her security deposit on the apartment before that, small violences, all of them legal, all of them wearing the costume of family. This was just the first one that had a face. Kellner was still looking at her, not unkindly, Just precisely. She sat. He dismissed Marcus with a glance, the way you might dismiss a delivery driver once the package has arrived, and something about that, the efficiency of it, the absence of drama, made her understand what kind of man she was dealing with. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't need to be. "Do you know what your brother owes me?" he asked. "Stepbrother," she said, a pause. Almost imperceptible. "Do you know what your stepbrother owes me?" $240,000, she said, plus whatever the interest rate is on whatever agreement he signed, which I'm guessing he didn't read carefully. Kellner looked at her for a moment with an expression that might have been, in another man, the beginning of interest. 263, he said. 18%, compounded monthly. She did the math in her head. It took about 4 seconds. He's been carrying this for 8 months. 9. She said nothing. She was thinking about Marcus's face on the drive over, the way he'd held the steering wheel at 10 and 2 like a man following rules he'd just made up, like adherence to traffic law might retroactively improve his character. "What exactly," she said carefully, "are you expecting from me?" Kellner folded his hands on the desk. His hands were large and there were 2 more scars, old ones, on his right knuckles. "Your brother, stepbrother, made an arrangement," he said with a patience that was its own form of authority. "You'll stay here, work the debt down. When it's satisfied, you leave. No harm, work how," she said. "My organization has a financial problem," he said. "Specifically, we have 3 people in accounting who are either incompetent or stealing from me, and I haven't determined which yet, because the records are in a state that makes the distinction impossible to identify." Elise stared at him. "You're a bookkeeper," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd already read whatever file he'd prepared on her, she realized. He knew. "I reconcile invoices for a third-party logistics company," she said. "That's not the same as the discrepancy is in the logistics arm," he said. She closed her mouth. The silence stretched between them. Outside, somewhere distant, a car passed. The lamplight didn't move. "You're not going to hurt me," she said finally. "No, you're not going to," she stopped. Started again. "The arrangement is just. Labor, he confirmed. And when the debt is satisfied, you walk out the front door." She thought about the apartment, the overheating laptop, the $19 an hour and the 40-hour weeks, the way Marcus had looked at the steering wheel. "I want it in writing," she said. Another pause. This one was different. This one, she thought, was the pause of a man reassessing. "All right," Kellner said. She moved into the east wing of the building that night, into a room that was larger than the entire apartment she'd shared with Marcus, with a window that looked out over a courtyard full of expensive silence. She didn't sleep. She sat at the desk they'd provided, an actual desk, not a kitchen table, with a lamp that didn't flicker, and she thought about numbers. The books they gave her access to the next morning were a disaster. Not chaotic, that would have been easier. They were almost right. They had the architecture of correct record-keeping with the contents of a slow, careful lie. Someone had been very patient and very smart, and also, she thought, slightly overconfident. The kind of overconfidence that comes from being smarter than everyone around you for too long. She started at the beginning. She always started at the beginning. By the end of the first week, she had identified 3 separate methodologies of extraction. By the end of the second, she could tell which one was being run by someone inside the organization, and which 2 were being facilitated by an outside party that was, based on the shell company structures, almost certainly a rival operation. She wrote up her findings in a report that was 12 pages long, single-spaced, with supporting documentation organized by date and cross-referenced by account number. She slid it under Kellner's office door at 7 in the morning because she hadn't slept and she didn't want to wait. By noon, he called her in. He was reading the report when she arrived. He was on page 9. She sat in the chair she'd sat in the first night and waited. He finished page 12, set the report down, and looked at her. "The inside person," he said. "Who?" "I don't have a name," she said. "I have an access pattern. Whoever it is has clearance to the payroll system and the vendor approval process. That narrows it to maybe 4 or 5 people, depending on how your permissions are structured." 8, he said. Then it's one of 8, she said. He was quiet for a moment. How long have you been able to read books like this? She thought about her father, who'd died when she was 11 and left behind nothing but a shoebox of receipts she'd organized by month and year because she hadn't known what else to do with her grief. She thought about every number she'd ever balanced against another number, every discrepancy she'd chased down in the dark. A while, she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. The outside operation, he said. You think it's Varro? She didn't know who Varro was. She filed the name away. I think it's someone who knows your vendor structure well enough to root through it. That implies either a former employee or an active informant. Or both, he said. Or both, she agreed. Over the following weeks, she barely left the East Wing. She wasn't prevented from leaving. The arrangement had been explicit on that point, and Kellner was, whatever else he was, a man who kept his terms. But there was always another file, another discrepancy thread she hadn't finished pulling. The work was the most interesting thing she had ever done. That was the part she hadn't expected. That the problem would be interesting enough to make her forget. Sometimes, for hours at a time, the circumstances under which she'd arrived. She started eating dinner at the table in the main kitchen, instead of her room. This happened gradually, the way most changes happen. One evening she was too tired to carry a plate back down the hall, and no one said anything. And then the next evening the same thing happened, and somewhere around the 5th evening it had simply become where she ate. Kellner ate at that table sometimes, not often. He was a man whose schedule seemed to operate on a logic that had nothing to do with conventional time. He would appear at the table at 10 at night with a cup of coffee and documents he was annotating in a very small, very precise handwriting, and he wouldn't speak, and she wouldn't speak. And the silence was not uncomfortable. Once he said, without looking up, "You grew up doing this." It wasn't a question. She'd noticed he did that, made observations in the grammar of questions without actually asking, which gave her the choice to answer or not. My dad kept every receipt from 1987 to the year he died, she said. When I was 12, I reorganized them into a spreadsheet to figure out if he'd overpaid his mechanic. Had he? By about $4,000 over 6 years, she said. The mechanic was charging him for parts that didn't exist. Kellner looked up from his documents. What did you do with that information? I was 12, she said. What did you do with it? She held his gaze. I wrote a letter to the mechanic's shop explaining the discrepancy and requested a refund on behalf of my father's estate. A pause. You were 12. He'd been stealing from my dad for 6 years, she said. Somebody had to say something. Kellner was quiet for a moment. Then he went back to his documents. But the corner of his mouth had moved, just slightly. She filed that away too. She found the inside person on a Tuesday. It was one of the 8, a man named Cresswell, who ran vendor approvals and had been systematically approving invoices from a company that didn't exist, routing the payments through 3 accounts and into what turned out to be a down payment on a house in Scottsdale, Arizona. He'd been doing it for 2 years and 3 months. He'd taken, in total, just under $400,000. She brought the documentation to Kellner that afternoon. He read it in 4 minutes. He looked up. You're certain, he said. The pattern is consistent across 27 separate transactions, she said. The vendor registration was submitted 3 days after Cresswell was granted approval access. He created the problem he was supposed to be preventing. Kellner set the documents down. He looked at her in that way he had, not like she was an employee, not like she was a problem, not like she was collateral. She couldn't quite name what the look was. She only knew it was different from the way most people looked at her, which was either through her or past her, the specific non-gaze reserved for people who are useful but not important. The debt is satisfied, he said. She had been waiting for this. She had been calculating toward this moment for weeks, adding up the hours, the findings, the documented value of what she'd recovered. She had known it was coming. She had a bag half-packed in the closet of the East Wing. She had a contact at a staffing agency who'd texted her twice asking when she'd be available. I know, she said. He held her gaze. You can leave today. The apartment was still there, technically. Marcus had paid 2 months' rent with money she suspected wasn't his. The laptop was still on the kitchen table, probably still overheating. The staffing agency was still texting. "The external operation," she said. "The one routing through your vendor structure. You haven't closed that yet." "No. The documentation I gave you shows the access points but not the current routing," she said. "It's probably shifted since they noticed the inside channel got cut off. They'll adapt." "They will," he said. "I could find the new routing," she said. Her voice was careful, even, the voice she'd been practicing her whole life. "It would take maybe 2 weeks. The pattern is distinctive. I know what to look for now." Kellner looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight was doing what it always did in this room, turning everything amber and still. "You could also walk out the front door," he said. "I could," she agreed. The silence expanded. She didn't fill it. She had learned over the past weeks that Kellner's silences were not voids to be filled. They were spaces where he made decisions, and the worst thing you could do was interrupt the process. 2 weeks, he said finally. 2 weeks, she confirmed. She found the new routing in 11 days. Then she found something else. A secondary ledger, buried inside a subsidiary's accounting structure, that had nothing to do with Varro's operation and everything to do with an internal power arrangement that she understood, even with her incomplete knowledge of the organization's politics, was significant. She cross-referenced it against the access logs she'd been granted and traced it backward 18 months, and found that someone very senior had been very quietly preparing for something. She sat with that information for 24 hours. Then she brought it to Kellner. He read the documentation in silence. It took him longer than usual. When he finished, he set it down and was still for a moment in a way she hadn't seen before, not the stillness of a man thinking, but the stillness of a man recalibrating. "Where did you find this?" he said. "It was in the subsidiary structure," she said. "I was tracing the Varro routing, and I went a layer deeper than I needed to, and it was there. Does anyone else know you found it?" "No." He looked at the documentation again, then at her. "Do you understand what this is?" "I understand what the numbers say," she said. "I don't know the names well enough to understand the politics." "If you did understand the politics," he said slowly, "you would understand that this is the kind of thing people have been killed for knowing." She held his gaze. Her hands were very still in her lap. She'd spent her whole life making herself still when things got loud around her. It was the only skill her childhood had given her that she was genuinely grateful for. "Then it's lucky I just understand the numbers," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, just shifted. "You could have kept this to yourself," he said. "You found it by accident. You could have closed the file and walked away." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about the mechanic, about the shoebox of receipts, about every number she'd ever followed to the end of its line, not because she was paid to, not because anyone asked, but because the discrepancy existed, and someone had to say something. "Because the ledger was wrong," she said simply. "I don't like wrong ledgers." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. She felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure, the sensation of something that has been one thing slowly becoming another. "Stay," Kellner said. Not as an order. He had given her orders at the beginning, in the technical sense, and she'd recognized the difference even then. "Stay," he said again. "Not as collateral, not to work off a debt, as—" He paused. She watched him search for the right word with the same precision he brought to everything else. "As someone who is useful because they want to be." She thought about the overheating laptop, the $19 an hour, the apartment where nobody knocked. She thought about the 11 days it had taken her to find a routing structure that his entire accounting department had missed for 8 months. She thought about the corner of his mouth, that single small movement when she'd told him about the letter to the mechanic. "I want a real contract," she said. "Scope of work, compensation, exit terms. I'll have something drafted by morning," he said. "I want to review the draft before signing." "Obviously," he said, and she thought she heard, very faintly, the thing that was not quite amusement but lived next to it. She went back to the East Wing and sat at the desk that had become her desk and opened the files that had become her files, and she thought about Marcus somewhere in the city, carrying his looseness, his relief, his eternal certainty that someone else's problem was never going to find its way back to him. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. She didn't arrange it. She didn't have to. What she found in the next 3 months, following numbers the way she always followed numbers, all the way to the end of the line, painted a picture of Marcus's business dealings that was comprehensive and damning, and that she handed to Kellner not because she had an agenda, but because the ledger was wrong, and she didn't like wrong ledgers. What Kellner did with that information was Kellner's business. He was meticulous about keeping those categories separate, and so was she. By the time the winter came, Elise had a proper office in the building, 2 people who reported to her, and a reputation in Kellner's organization that she hadn't sought and couldn't quite account for. People spoke to her differently, not with fear. She wasn't that, and she didn't want to be, but with a careful attention that she recognized after a while as the attention reserved for someone whose judgment matters. Kellner called her in one evening in December, when the light outside was the pale grey of a city trying to decide whether to snow. He was standing instead of sitting, which was unusual, and he had a glass of something amber that he hadn't touched. "I want to restructure the financial oversight of the entire organization," he said. "Full access, all subsidiaries, all holdings." She understood what he was offering, not just professionally. She understood the other thing, the thing they had never said directly, the thing that had been present in the dinners and the silences, and the way he'd looked at her in this room on a dozen different occasions. She thought about trust, about what it actually meant when you stripped away the rhetoric. Trust was a ledger too. It was assets and liabilities, risk and return. It was the decision to extend credit before the debt was proven. She thought about what it meant that she was standing in this room at all, that she'd come in as collateral, and stayed because the work was interesting, and then stayed longer because of something she couldn't enter into any column she knew. "I want co-signature authority on any transaction above 50,000, she said. He looked at her steadily. "Done. And I want the organizational chart," she said. "The real one, not the one that exists on paper." A pause. "That's not something I give to people." "I know," she said. "I'm not people." The silence, the lamplight, the glass of something amber that he still hadn't touched. "No," Kellner said quietly, "you're not." She had arrived in this building as a line item, as collateral, the word she'd never been able to fully wash out of her memory, the word she'd carried through every long night at that desk, every file, every discrepancy chased to its end. But that wasn't what she was anymore. She was the woman who knew where all the money went, and in Kellner's world, the person who controlled the ledger controlled everything. She had understood that from the beginning. She had just needed the rest of the world to catch up.